recording. This is the November 15th CLM, Collective Learning Meeting. I'll go ahead and be presenting today on my emerging state actor model with some housekeeping items. We have a colloquium coming up December 1st. There is still only one WPI student presenting. Slots are available at 15 minutes, and half of that's going to be given to Q&A, so you really only need a 7-minute presentation. Don't have to have a model. We've had people present without models. You can have a topic, you can present some ideas, but we are eager for more WPI people to present. We will not have a CLM next week. That will be Thanksgiving week, but the week after that, Shia will be presenting at the CLM.
Might be, yeah.
Definitely. Positive thinking. And if that works well, hopefully she'll be presenting at the colloquium as well. So without further ado, kind of jumping into the model, I wanted to quickly go over, since the last meeting on this didn't work very well, if you click on the screen that has the model on it, the graphs, you'll get a better view. And we'll be working from this for most of the session. So real quick, as a reminder of how we got here, the original causal loop diagram is depicted here of emerging state actors. And this has a lot of the feedbacks that I've been studying for a couple of years now and developed. And the original model was able to model this via a number of sectors. But left in the green were things I could never model. So the behavior of population on resistance and uprising against an actor. The behavior of population on choosing a side. Choosing, do I go with the government or the insurgent? The behaviors of population on things like legitimacy. And finally, recruiting and desertion. These were all sectors originally left out. This summer has been about adding this detail into the model and getting ethnographic context. So now the model distinguishes between Sunni Arab, Shia Arab, and Kurdish Sunni. It distinguishes between red actor, who is ISIS, and green actor, which is the state. And it's even been set up to allow both sides to participate. So whereas before it was only what does ISIS do and how do we stop ISIS, now the state can make actions and it can cause consequences for itself. I wanted to run through a few quick simulations just to show where we're at, but what I'm looking for feedback on is I'm actually now doing this work in relation with the military, and I am looking for feedback on how do you take things like this and get application research out of it when you're working with an actual client. And then also, as always, good hypothesis testing or structured feedback or things like that. The model starts in equilibrium now too. In the past, it would start given a set, but now it starts in equilibrium. And it runs for 20 years. And the reason I did that is when doing boundary testing, I found that equilibrium state is when, you can see here, we're just looking at one ethnography. We're looking at the Sunni ethnographic perception of green. So green here is Syria and Iraq. It's a combined government state. Sunni support by level. So this is a percentage, like a survey. And support by population, total garrison needed. And then the rest of these will come into play. But you can see it's consistent. It's about 25 million. They're at 100% view the government as legitimate. Those two choices are a little bit hard to see. It's view the government as legitimate or view the government as the best choice for now. The garrison is how much police force and law enforcement they need to manage a population of that. And if you go into the model, there's data on this for each ethnographic population as well as all the populations combined. But we're just going to work with Sunni because it's easier to see what happens. So it runs in equilibrium, but we can test it now using the game. This is the first time I've done gaming in Vensim. So I had to learn that. And a shout out to Tom Fitteman, who's been very helpful both on subscripting challenges and gaming challenges. This is the dashboard of options. You have really the theater strategy options are more like setting up operational parameters, how you instantiate the model. Measures of effect are what your outcomes are, but your operational orders are going to be what the different sides. How do I get this to disappear?
Tim, could you say again what green and red are?
Sure. Green in military vocabulary, the U.S. military vocabulary. The green actor is the government that the U.S. supports. Okay. The green actor. The red actor is whoever's opposing that from an indigenous standpoint, a local. So in the context of Syria and Iraq, Iraq would be the green, ISIS would be the red. Okay. There's nothing to say, though, that now the way this is model's built, we couldn't have green be Syria and red be rebels against Syria. Because you can kind of state that Syria is the green, is the government actor, and red is the insurgent. Blue and purple are now state sponsors who can intervene with outside forces to support either green or red.
But in case of Syria, the US government supports the rebels.
It supports the rebels, yes. Yeah, so the green is the government. In this case, what you would have is, if you were purely modeling Syria alone as our support for the rebels, which are not ISIS, I would just note that red equals Syrian rebels and purple equals US, because it's a little bit flipped around. We're supporting, but you can basically do mirror images, and you can now model all these. You can model the US supporting an insurgency, the US supporting government, Russian or Iran supporting. You can model US supporting one actor and Iran supporting a different actor. You can play around with these.
So the support translates into some sort of assistance to that actor?
Yep, you can see here that each side now has what are called operational orders. And in military, an operational order is a long-term, it's not like a tactical, like go take that hill. It says for the next 6 months, do this. And so this is at a strategic level, but you can allocate what you're doing. So the local actors can do propaganda, conventional warfare, indirect attacks, recruiting, war crimes, which is like ethnic cleansing or crimes against humanity, armed civil affairs. They can try and break their fellows out of prison. They can conduct terrorism. They can stop terrorism, use counterterrorism, prison duty, or they can buy equipment. But the state sponsor side, what the state actor intervenes with, their intervention is to help the green or red actors. So first of all, they have to have a size that they intervene with. And then they can do advanced equipment. They can provide and train on advanced equipment. They can teach them how to be training for security, so training them in counterterrorism and combating terrorism.
So there is a metric which translates these actions into parameters?
Yes, because all of these are essentially percentages. So if you have a certain amount of troops, it's at the theater level, it's more of an allocation. I want 30% of my forces to be providing weapons, 25% to be training, 25% embedded in combat troops, and maybe 25% supporting air power. We're going to go through one of these scenarios.
I'm just trying to understand how do you implement this support. So is you just change a parameter set that represents this support?
You activate a time where the intervention happens, you activate a desired personnel level, and then there's a time delay as the people come in, and they have to support themselves. So there's a tooth to tail ratio that says of every 1,000 intervening folks you have, so many percent are just doing logistics and other stuff to keep them around. And that tells you how many people you have left, and that tells you then how many actions you can do with them. So the model works on military actions, which is a number of actions per squad you have. But you don't choose how many squads you have. You just choose how you're allocating your percentage, and the model takes care of the rest in the structure.
Can you accommodate changes of color in actors here? Because Syria's got multiple colors, and some of those that may be viewed as allies of green are actually maybe red. So
you because of the nature of subscripting, you can change some of the subscripting, but you have to be, right now it's set as one actor against another being supported. There are places for third-party actors to play roles. There's that would capture some of those other lesser ones. But right now it's set with 3 ethnographic subscripts and 2 actor subscripts, green and red.
Okay, so I was thinking, if you go back a bit in time, how would you do the Anbar Awakening?
The Anbar Awakening, I'll actually show that in progress. You can have, each actor can have an uprising against them. So red, even though red is the insurgents, can end up having an uprising by locals against their control. And that would represent the Anbar Awakening. That's actually a critical dynamic of what keeps ISIS in check, or what might keep ISIS in check.
Okay.
What I wanted to start out with is show, it starts in equilibrium, but show a real quick example of what it takes to get out of equilibrium and start an insurgency. Because one of the things I realized very quickly is if everyone starts viewing the government as legitimate, it is not easy to get them to take up arms, which makes sense. It's plausible, but it was unexpected for me just how difficult it is to get that to happen.
What I'm thinking, there is your statement of the policy, statement of the intervention. Second is how it's implemented in the market. Maybe you want to create a table or something which states the nature of intervention, and then what parameter changes.
I can share after this. I have a full text document.
I don't mean to.
Yeah. There is a text document that goes through each, like, what does it mean to do prison breaks, and what is that intended to be used at, and then how does it work in the model. So there's a document supporting that it'd probably be, and it has tables that say these are the options. That'd probably be good to go through and share afterwards. So what I wanted to show first off is the nature of these conflicts are almost all begun. So we have equilibrium. Let's try and start an insurgency by having the actor. You can see here I've got some of these are gamified now. These ones that are highlighted are ones that you can change, and it moves forward every time you move forward. It moves through 5 periods, which is about 2.5 years. And if you didn't change anything, it would just stay in equilibrium. But let's say that we go forward 10 years, and now we say that for some reason the government, the green government, decides to start providing less services to Kurdish and Sunnis, which is, and we'll just leave that and carry forward the rest of the model. Right? When we go look at we can see here now that what began in equilibrium, and this is just Sunni perception, there's also Kurdish and Shia, but you can see here, if you were to do a survey that said how many view the government as legitimate, would be declining here, and how many viewed them as the best choice, calculated legitimacy, falls here. This is represented in actual population numbers. So you can see here that where they started out at 25 million, as they begin to decline out of legitimacy support, they begin to increase in calculated legitimacy. Now, calculated legitimacy still supports the government. And you can see here that although there's some change in the total garrison needed, there's no insurgency. So even though you dropped government services by 50% for years, it made people upset, it made them question, but there was no insurgency. If we try,
so so is there a tipping point or something?
Yes, that's kind of what I'm getting to. So I want to show here, this is a second one just to show how, so again, 10 years with no change. Now we go down and we'll do 25%, which means that they're essentially, think of it as if they're providing government services and one means they're providing 100% of what's needed, now they're only providing 25%. They really cut out just about everything. And you forward that for the remainder of the simulation. And you now see an endogenous creation of an insurgency. What happens is, you can see here that as the support declines, the Sunnis, the number of people viewing it as legitimate goes down, the calculated legitimacy goes up, but there's also this little green line is the ones who are coerced. These are the ones who are almost imprisoned in their own state. They no longer have any faith in the government. They are coerced. They're only kept in there by military power. And some of those will start escaping into what are called unaligned. And unaligned can now choose a side. So you see here, and this is, these are millions, and this is only 10 to 1,000, so it's not a lot, but this is a rate of the unaligned moving to ISIS. So this isn't even ISIS fighters yet. These are people who might be sympathetic to ISIS or supporting them. From that population, though, ISIS begins to get combatants and start taking over territory. Now, it doesn't take over much. It only takes over 1%. But you can see here now that ISIS has territory. It, too, has a level of support in population and perception. So what you really see here is we didn't say ISIS gets so many fighters at turn 22. We didn't say ISIS is going to have this numbers. We just said the government cuts out support. What happens? So let's do a third scenario.
So before you leave this one, sorry. So almost just under 3 years go by, you have your first sort of increase.
Each time period is 6 months. So 30 is actually
2015.
15 years.
Okay, so 15 years in, you start having. So when's the event where you?
The event happens at 10. So at 5 years in, it takes about 10 years of cutting people out that much to begin getting an uprising. And these are not like detailed parameters. These are notional dynamics. So, but it takes a lot longer than just a few years. In fact, we could do one where we can test what happens if the government gets wise and recovers itself. So we go forward 10 years again in equilibrium. We drop these to both to 25%. And now we'll only forward this for another 10 years. And at year 20, the government says, that was a bad idea. Let's go back and support them at full. So this is a scenario now where you had maybe a regime or administration that was repressive, but it changes. And then this carries forward for the rest. And we can start to see now. You can see here, no insurgency arose. It got really dicey, right? They were going downhill, but this is where the repression started. Maybe it was a prime minister or a president, not speaking of any local ones, but there's an administration that goes on for 5 or 10 years, but then it reverses course. And then you can see here they're trying to regain legitimacy. And you can see the population isn't recovering. You still have some that are just only viewed as, they don't forget. It takes them a long, but they aren't in uprising. They're not in violent revolt. They're not. So it kind of gives hope to say, look, if you reverse course politically, you don't always have to have an insurgency. It's not a foregone conclusion. But as Professor Saeed points out, this is assuming they're going to magically reverse course, which is very rare. They usually don't.
No, these are what if scenarios.
Yeah, yeah. Just to show that the model has. The final one I want to show before getting into the intervention space.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
So is there, like, for what you call the start of the insurgency, is it they start choosing sides, it starts growing this dissatisfaction. So you get people now that are susceptible to insurgency, or whatever it's called. Can you use the graph? You changed it again?
Well, I'll get up an example that demonstrates what you're talking about.
Like when have you crossed the threshold? You've gone for non-insurgency state or insurgency state.
You cross it. So there is a 3-stage chain of belief in the government. This is anthropologically. There is, I view them as legitimate, which is fully opt into the government. You follow the rules. You do it because you think it's necessary. You don't question it. There's calculated legitimacy, which is where you're making a strategic choice. So this might be the US, this might be France, this might be China. There is a well-established state where people, they may have, doesn't mean it's just or fair, but they view it as legitimate. Calculated legitimacy means this is the best choice of me for this period of time. If a better choice comes along, I'm taking it. And this might be tribes in Afghanistan that aligned with government and said, hey, we can get power, we can get influence. The final one is something called coercion. Coerced states mean the only reason I'm still here is because you're forcing me. You're military, and there's a limit. If you think about this, there's an outflow coming from this that in the model is based off their ability to garrison. These two require less police forces to maintain, but as you move people here, you really start needing more and more police forces. Like think about East Germany keeping people from leaving. You need to allocate more and more resources. And as you can, some begin leaving to unalign, which means they have no side. And I apologize for those who are on the screen here. Unaligned here means they have no side. And in this space, what they do is they look out, not over the past, but they look over the future and say, who is being better for my ethnography? Who is doing more for my side going forward? It's a momentum. It's measuring momentum. And they may choose to join the other side in calculated legitimacy. So this now is a wholly political dynamic. There's no violence. There's no fighting or blowing up, but they may choose to go, they degrade from legitimate to calculated legitimate to coerced to unaligned to choosing a different side. Now, once you have people in calculated legitimacy, the model lets the actor begin recruiting combatants. and they can begin capturing territory and actually conquering. So there's a conquering function here where you can take people who were fine with the government, they get conquered and brought within ISIS control, and they all start here and coerced. So whoever's seizing territory has a problem if their population starts in coerced, and they have to prove to them to move them up the chain. So with each ethnography, there's constant moving back and forth across these chains.
So sometimes you hear the term police state.
Yes.
That would be coerced legitimacy.
Yes. If a majority of your population is in coerced, and this is where we can start defining more crisply what is the threshold of a police state. Is it when 50% of your population is in coerced? Is it when a flow rate is a certain percent is moving towards coerced versus moving to legitimacy? I don't know what those answers are.
Yeah, all those thresholds are arbitrary.
Yeah. But the concept is you could also track a failed state. In this thing, if you say you defeated ISIS, but most of your people ended up in either calculated legitimacy or coercion, you can't really say you won, which is certainly, I think, the situation in Afghanistan. That Afghanistan, we don't have a stable government that's credible unto itself that is encouraging people to move towards it. They may be aligned with it temporarily because they view it as giving them benefits or patronship or things like that. But there's this, and then it kind of is able now to describe this, that you can't just win this militarily. You have to have something for the other side to believe in.
Tim, and you mentioned earlier the timeline for insurgency being on the order of 10 years. That happened a lot quicker, I think, right? After the Iraq War, after we were dumb enough to fire everybody in Saddam's army?
Sure. So keep in mind that at equilibrium, we have 100% of the population starts as viewing the government legitimate. They view, after the Iraq War, you could easily say that a whole bunch of people were actually in calculated legitimacy or coerced states. They weren't 100% behind the coalition. I've actually run this where you start with different population levels in these different boxes to begin with, and it dramatically affects the performance. So in the Iraq War, I would say what happened in 2003, you could say almost the entire population was in a coerced state, and we had to earn them into calculated legitimacy. And that may have happened with Shia, but it didn't happen with Sunnis.
Right.
And so you can actually get a very quick insurgency. But the comment about the 10 years is if everyone views the government as legitimate, it is not easy unless, here's the unless, this is the one I was prepping. Now we're doing one where the government is actually suppressing with violence. And I'm putting in here 0.1% is being used on war crimes. So a war crime is kind of a broad category for ethnic cleansing, humanitarian abuses, but it's going out and basically killing your own population and refugees. And you can use it, you can actually simulate ethnic cleansing by using this, and refugees will flee your state and they'll go away. But this is now the government taking an action like that in addition to cutting just services. Now they're doing something violent. And we forward this for 2 years. And again, now someone stops, the regime goes away. Last time when we stopped, we ended up not having an insurgency. So now we're going to see when you add just a little bit of violence, a little bit of state-sponsored violence, what happens. Whoops, and I actually don't know what will happen. We'll all learn at the same time. So let's see here. Hopefully it does something. Nope, I think I did that wrong. Hang with me for just a second here. I think I cut it off. Okay, so let me pay attention here. So we go forward 10 years with no change. Then we drop this to 25%. We start suppression at a tenth of and what a tenth of 1% means, all the forces that aren't involved in garrisoning, a tenth of 1% of them are now going out as death squads or things like that, police things. We advance another couple of years, we change this back, regime stops. And the interesting thing with having a game scenario set up is you can actually do these sort of interim policy changes where what happens if they reverse course partway through or change their thinking. So here we have now. So even though they stopped, you can see here if we go through this, they cut services and at year 10, but then about 15 years later, they reversed course, a new administration tried to make right and get them back. But the problem is because violence is now involved, the population drops much more dramatically. And you get a much larger increase for the unaligned. This is a much larger number than it was before. And now they're really starting to, it gives ISIS more combatants, they control more territory, and they increase their population. Again, none of this has an intervention from a state sponsor outside the area. This is all internal dynamics, but it shows, I think, what happens when you add violence to the mix. When you have state-sponsored violence against an ethnographic group, it makes things much more complicated to reverse course, because it sort of takes a life on its own, which was sort of your hypothesis, is you use control and we're arbitrarily having them reversed, but in reality, they might use the justification of violence for more repression. So now we're gonna play a game and you guys get to pick. We're gonna rerun this scenario, but we're gonna let the outside intervene. We're gonna have the US intervene at year 20, we'll have the US intervene and we'll see, you guys get to pick how many people we intervene with. So let's see, we start it, move it forward 10 years in equilibrium, drop this to 25%. We start doing humanitarian war crimes, cleansing, all sorts of bad stuff. You know, in the Iraq example, this would be the Shia death squads, for Fred, when you're talking about, and you can make it a lot faster than just 10 years if you start introducing violence. So now we're at the point where the US says to intervene, we're gonna require you to be nice to people. You can't go around killing them anymore. So all these go back to the center, and we now, as a policymakers, we only get one choice in this simplified model, which is how many troops we want to send in. It's already set up that these troops will spend a quarter of their time providing advanced equipment to the military fighting the insurgents. They're going to spend a quarter of their time training security forces to counter terrorism. They're going to provide air power, and they're also going to do embedded combat advisors. So the question is, how many do we want to intervene? 10,000, 50,000, 100,000?
What's the assessed size of the insurgency?
I don't know if you can look at that interim. Okay, you can start. No, you can't really look at it interim. It's probably, you know there's an insurgency going on. We knew that last time it got up to 150, 200,000 pretty quickly.
Is it possible to test the sensitivity of that?
Oh, you can. Yeah, it would be.
Between 10,000 and 100,000.
Not in the game scenario. It would be a separate test. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is more of a war game test for people in the room to say, what would you want to try and see what happens.
So can we start with 10,000 and then?
Sure. What I don't know, so now.
I would go big and go fast.
So we have a go big, go fast. We have a go small, go easy.
Let's try both. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll try both. We'll start with 10,000. So this now, as you look at this, you see it may be a little small. What this says is blue or purple intervention size, subscript green. What it means is these troops are coming to the aid of green. If you put them down here, it would be intervening on behalf of red, which is where you can get into your kind of, there's not truly a second dimension of actor that's blue or purple. It's just who they support, green or red. So to your question, we could easily say green is Syria, red is a Syrian rebel, and we'd be entering the US forces down here to support the rebels. So they come in at 10,000. And we run the rest of the model and see what happens. And you can see now here in the bottom right, you have your intervention by blue to support green. Here's your total personnel. You can see there's a time delay. They don't just all show up at once. They've got to deploy. And you now see there's a lot.
18 to 30, so 12, 6 years as a deploy.
18 to, it's a time delay of, I think it takes, I took the R4Gen, it takes 18 months to deploy. Okay, so I mean, getting 100,000, so this would have been, most of your deployment happens in 18 to 24, yeah, 6 years. 6 is 3 years. You can accelerate that time delay or change it.
What's the picture above? So the right one,
This one?
the middle right. Yeah,
This one? So this is the perception. So you can see here the size of the red state. These are the number of people and population they have. So coerced is conquered. They've conquered a lot of people who are coerced. And then the calculated legitimacy and the legitimate view ISIS as a legitimate state. very small, down only under 1 million. But their perception of those people who have it have increased because ISIS has been building its government and sort of enforcing it. Over time, it kind of people shift into this legitimate state absent other factors. And you can see here that, let me see if I'm reading this right. The percent that viewed the actor as the best choice for now is growing slowly. It jumped up for legitimate because there's so few people in legitimacy. It's sort of one of those things, if you only have 10 people, they're very happy at 100%. But as you start getting more people, it drops off. So the intervention of 10,000 seemed to have reduced the number of combatants and the overall percent of the territory controlled. So it seemed to be somewhat effective. We wanted to try. So let's write down that it got up to about 100,000 troops and maybe looks like 15% territory, and see if 100. What do you want to do, Fred?
What's the spectrum?
There's
50,000.
What?
Can you go 50,000?
You can go 50. You can go 100,000 if you want.
Let's just try 50.
Okay, let me write down.
Troops for $50, right?
All right. And what we're doing with these is working with military planners to understand the dynamics of what happens when you do different size interventions or choose different options. In this case, we aren't going through all the things. Like we could do an intervention that wasn't combative; it was proper.
So the model for deploying troops and getting them on, task, you just have a function in the back there for that.
It's a level with the flow. So and as a desired, it's a goal gap function. I have a goal of so many desired troops.
Well, I'm saying the delay is if the ramping is some kind of math model for that.
Yes, I think if that's what.
That's not something you don't control. You have any parameters to control that?
Well, we can change the value of how long it takes. It's currently set to a certain value, and you can say, look, if you want to say you're only going to deploy 100, and you want to say it takes months, you can do that. But if you want to start deploying tens of thousands, it's going to take, at least in the U.S., from saying go, I want to do something. It takes an incredibly long amount of time. So now we do it, and we're going to go ahead now, reduce the war crimes. So I'm always reducing these war crimes because it's actually, we can do one where we don't reduce it and sees what happened, but I'm assuming it's the, okay, so you wanted to try 50,000, Fred?
Right.
So you can see for a 5-fold increase in troops, we only got, ISIS still controls about 10% of the territory, 12%. So it went from 15 to 12, and it went from about a little under 100,000 to actually over 100,000. Anyone have a guess of why that's happening?
Well, how many of that 50,000 were actually warfighters?
Good question. So we go take a look here. And this is where we can explore. So here's the blue intervention, right? The actual number of blue personnel is here, but there's this number of blue logistics that's a tip to tail ratio. And so you actually, of the 50,000 that we deployed, close to 30,000 of them are busy doing logistics, which is, this number comes from the military. So it's a doctrinal number. It's about 63%. So even though you deployed, every time you deploy another 10,000 people, 6,300 of them are maintaining bases, they're building buildings, they're doing cooking, they've got base security, they're doing headquarters or administration. So you only ever,
That's a pretty heavy logistical burden.
but that's the standard for the U.S. military. Yeah, that's why I'm saying that one comes from Docker. And trust me, from Afghanistan, it is not far off. So first of all, the more you intervene,
Well, I guess the question, let's do it. I mean, 90%.
just because you say you have 50,000 troops doesn't mean you have 50,000 people warfighting.
Do you have? I was reading.
Good comment, Fred.
Do you have
What else?
like other technology, deploying other technology?
They're deploying advanced equipment. So like advanced equipment could be better weapons, better communication. Yeah. Now air power is what simulates that.
Okay.
So there is a function, but
it's funny. The reason I was saying the logistical burden. So you're saying like how we always create autonomous vehicle systems. It's like, oh, so we have automated something. This goes. But a Global Hawk takes about 300 people to run it for so many hours.
yeah,
The military's having an inverted problem.
Well, here in the air power, I do have, in the air power, you have so many squads per squadron. It takes 30 squads per squadron, and a squadron has 11 elements in it. So you really need close to 300 people to support 11 units of air power. So it's not like you get, I'm just counting fighters, I'm counting the whole sustainment maintenance, and that again comes from the doctrine. That's a doctrine. There's another effect though, which is, I'm only looking at the green. Oh, that's why, because I've got, let's clear out all the last run. This doesn't. There we go.
The reason I asked about the size of the insurgency is that, as you know, the British in Malaysia and other occasions have come up with rules of thumb of what the force ratio needs to be typically to suppress an insurgency.
And that's what I was just looking at here. Is you've got a percent. Here we go. You can see here is the percent local troops, right? This is the Shia, which represent the majority population, right? We haven't even talked about the Shia yet. They got 30 million people. We never repress them. We never suppress them. But as soon as you have 50,000 troops coming in, the percentage of foreign troops to local troops starts to change, even moderately, even a little bit. And that means more Shia are now upset, and they take more troops away from the forces you would have used to fight ISIS to garrison and police. It's called the accidental guerrilla. It's as we move in more and more forces, and it's a ratio amount. And if we looked at the more foreign troops you have, the harder it is to garrison the overall state. And so simply by increasing from 10,000 to 50,000, we got some additional troops doing it, but that huge influx of additional troops made it more difficult in the Shia. And now we have problems in the Shia where we didn't have problems before. ISIS really suffers from this effect if we look at let's go on the backwards way. Where is that? It's interesting. So this should be reversed. But it's basically showing that, and it says local troops. It actually, the 60% means now increasingly more and more troops are coming from foreigners because ISIS has foreign fighters coming from outside, and that makes it harder for them to garrison the population they have. So both of these sides deal with this dynamic because they can bring in outside support, but when you do that, you lose local support, and it's a balancing act between what am I having the intervening forces do, and how would that benefit my overall efforts versus simply bringing them in. If you notice in Iraq and Syria now, we don't have huge footprints. We don't have 100,000 troops there anymore. We're a very small footprint. So this is some of the things that planners are supposed to learn when they're going through and planning 100,000 troops or 200,000 troops. In addition to cost and risk and all that, you're basically saying the more troops we have doesn't mean you always get a lot more benefit. You could actually create worse situations somewhere else.
Now, in terms of, what the other side requires in terms of garrisoning its own space.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the folks like ISIS and others use terror to leverage their numbers, right?
It does, but terrorism has its own consequence.
Oh yeah, right.
So you can see here terrorist attacks, and this is if you're doing. You can see here ISIS terrorist attacks. So they're actually. This is an interesting.
Well, I'm just referring to terrorizing the local populace of an occupied area. So
to that point, this shows ISIS's behavior using terrorist attacks via Sunni, Shia, and Kurd. They actually spark a lot of terrorism early on, and then they stop. And the reason this drops off is ISIS's strategy is to terrorize their own population and create so much violence and instability in the system that people don't believe in the government, even though it's ISIS doing the terrorist attacks.
Right.
And as soon as they start governing, they stop the terrorist attacks against their own citizens, but continue against the Shia. And this comes out in the ethnographic. Here we go.
Right. Yeah, they convince the populace that the government cannot protect them any longer.
Exactly. The net change, the perception change from violence shows that over time, here is ISIS doing propaganda and armed civil affairs to make people believe good government, right? But then you have this huge drop because they're using violence. Now, they are keeping the population as coerced, right? They're able to keep them in. But the population is turning against them more and more because of the violence. Mm-hmm. And you can see here where Shia, and this is Shia here, and this is Kurd, they separate very largely from Sunni, which is, again, something we see. And you can play with these parameters. I mean, it's all set up. How much does ISIS like this guy or that guy? These are all arbitrary parameters to play with, but it shows the ability to segment a country by ethnography and have an insurgency pick one ethnography and try and suppress the other ones, and how that helps and hurts them over time. Mm-hmm. So
now, are you able to differentiate the what I'll call the operating style on the U.S. side? Because I know the Marines experimented with moving into local areas and basically integrating with their local populace.
I don't have this is not a tactical simulator to that extent. It's an allocation simulator at the theater level. You could approximate that by there's an experience level that helps you fight and be more effective. There's morale levels. You can adjust some of those parameters to create that influence, but I would say you got to be cautious because it's easy to say, well, the Marines do it better and overstate a parameter that then throws the system out of whack versus the dynamic of simply by being there and being a foreign entity, there's going to be some backlash against them, and then overcoming that is the trick.
Right.
Now, the best way to do it in this is not through military means. Military can create the security, but to build the government capability. If the best way to get people on your side is to have a credible government that's serving people well, and they'll start moving through this legitimacy chain up on their own accord. They'll start choosing to say, hey, I was calculated legitimacy, now I want to be legitimacy. I was coerced, now I want to be calculated. They'll start, but if you don't have a viable alternative, they won't make that choice.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if a foreign entity tries to help a government build its legitimacy, would it be viewed with suspicion?
It would be, in this model, you have an option here where you could have your force called armed civil affairs, which is simply, rather than the government building procedures, you have your military building procedures. They're maybe doing health checks. They're doing some sort of services through the military. If you had them all doing that and information operations, which is like propaganda, they're not killing anyone. There's no like violence. They would be generating only positive effects, but it would be counteracted to some degree simply by being foreign. It wouldn't be overwhelming. You'd probably get a lot of benefit out of it. I don't have them set up as gaming right now, but I may be able to run it.
That's interesting. So if they are engaged in some sort of social services,
let's change that.
Health or education.
Let's take out the combat advisory. Let's test this and see. We'll take out the 25% for combat advising and the 25% for air power, where they're attacking people, which is, here we go. And we'll put 25% in health services and like civil affairs, I call it armed civil affairs, and 25% in information operations, which is propaganda about the armed civil affairs.
Is there other type of social services?
It's armed civil affairs is a catch-all. It doesn't get into healthcare versus schooling versus building infrastructure, dams, utilities. It's just all armed civil affairs is one bucket. Because this is at the theater level, you're sort of saying, what should our people be doing? But you kind of, what it actually is down at the company level, and this doesn't get down to that level. It could, but that might be an additional level of aggravation. So we'll set this up. So for 10 years, nothing happens. We have a governor comes in who starts suppressing the Sunni and Kurdish population. They also do some ethnic cleansing or death squads. That goes forward for 10 years. Then there's an intervention and we say knock that off. So we stop the bad stuff. Now, how many people do we want to have intervene with this more peaceful way of doing it? We know what's happened with 10,000 military intervention and 50,000 military intervention. How many do we want to have intervene into a less military style?
There's still the 60% logistical burden.
Yep.
let's try
10,000.
10,000,
Okay.
so that we can compare with the previous one.
And I honestly have no idea what will happen, but this is a good test. No, they actually increased. They managed to recover their ethnographic, but it happened too late. So it helped. It's helping them increase their perception, but ISIS was already capturing enough territory to grab it. So it looks like they got about the same level, but we're now up to close to 19% rather than 15%.
And if you simulate it for a longer period of time,
it would probably come back down. It would. Well, you'd have to still defeat ISIS militarily. That's the trick part, is putting in government controls and things like that prevents more people from leaving and joining ISIS, which really runs things out of control. But once ISIS exists, it's its own entity. It can conquer, it can grab hold of population. And we can see here the impact, I think, of the this is the government. You can see that's
By the way, in terms of non-combatants, do you include sort of residual infrastructure that's left behind in terms of developing utilities, schools, all that kind of stuff?
the overall, it's aggregated to a very, and you can see here how the introduction of the introduction of the U.S. forces doing well helped to some degree to get it back up almost to where they were. But so it did help with, and that's what you're looking at here is all that is. It doesn't distinguish infrastructure, utility. It says institutional procedures. This is governing capability writ large. And the number is, for each person, you have to have one institutional procedure widget per person for legitimacy ongoing. So if you have 30 million population, you have to have 30 million governing capacity procedures. So what they actually do is not specified in this model.
Explain that governing capacity.
Credible government, it's the delivery of all services, the delivery of all government infrastructure. It's a notional concept that says if you deliver, for each person, if you deliver one per period, they will eventually move to legitimacy. But if you deliver less than that amount, they'll start moving away.
So what's it with legitimacy? Is it is there any kind of, I'll call hysteresis, where they'll stay in legitimacy? You can remove some of the extra overhead associated with it.
Yeah, you can get up to a if you look here,
The stickiness
yeah.
of it, I guess it's the.
So you can see here how they got back up to the maximum survey is 100%, but there can be a buffer above that, which is above beyond, is a buffer that keeps them from going, becoming susceptible down the road. If you're doing more. Now, there's not an economic piece in this. I have economics for control resources, which is the military, the equipment, the things like that, the money that is made for resources. I don't have economics for social delivery of services. I simply have it as being how many procedures you have, and there's a base cost, but it just is a really aggregate cost. It doesn't do well to say we improve the economy, therefore the economy is doing 10% better, people get more jobs. It's not an economic model.
Very interesting. Nice work, Tim. I've got to jump to a meeting here, but thanks for sharing this. This is great stuff.
What do the rest of you think about what would be an interesting thing to study in application of this? Because we're building an interface that's much simpler and easier to use, and so that it's sliders and things like that. But for military planners using this, if they give permission, I want to propose them and say, I would like to study the use of this model being deployed now in an actual context. Next week I go up to DC. We've got this now instantiated for an island of Australia. I won't mention which one, but they want to start using that to understand and just do a learning environment for operational planners. What would be a way to set up application research as opposed to theory research, which has been what this is up to this point?
How about an unstructured spot like Somalia?
We can change the scenario, but that would still seem, so that's an application of a different country. I guess I'm wondering is there a style of research I can do when I'm actively working with stakeholders that is useful to the field?
Okay.
I think the model complexity comes in the way.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's a simple structure that people can understand. The stakeholders can understand.
So would that be like testing their survey of understanding based on some see it simple and some see it complex, or what lessons they take away? Like some sort of before and after survey?
That's interesting.
Or their concept of validity or confidence in the model? Because was it?
Could you pick a historical episode with a leaner model and actually validate it to some extent as a case study?
I can do that as a case study, but that wouldn't be something I could do with stakeholders. It would be just a historical research exercise.
There was
Right.
a people in SDR a few years ago. I think it was Richardson and Linus and what's his name? PhD student in Albany, Naveen.
Mm-hmm. Richardson Linus.
And was use of simple models for public policy or something like that.
Because I definitely am going to simplify this. When this gets converted over to Stella Architect, the Stella Architect will be a much simpler model. But I will note what was interesting is even throughout the course of all this discussion we had here, just walking through, it almost is human nature to ask about disaggregation. Do you have that additional detail in your model?
Yeah, I mean, the client always wants that.
Yeah.
And yeah, what I'm thinking is I don't, it's very complex, I don't understand the model.
Yeah.
Basically, I would delete the scenarios because, well, Tim has done the scenarios and Tim's a good modeler.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the basis.
Right.
But I don't understand the model.
So I think, so doing some sort of test work, because this can easily be distilled down. If I take out a lot of the policies, there's only 6 or 7, 8 stocks that matter.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe even less. I'm trying to get it down. But there's a lot of stuff in here that's like terrorism versus propaganda. Well, at the end of the day, it all affects perception. So you could just say percentage of perception effect and just really aggregate it. And that's what I'm working on the Stella version. See, this is built in Vensim. The client wants it in Vensim. But there's a Stella Architect version I'm working on that's going to have an interface and all that, and a much simpler. And it would be interesting to maybe do some before and after surveys with the two kinds.
And in that Stella version, if you can use hierarchy.
Yes, sectors. Yeah.
Right.
So use the modules.
That's
the
it.
modules.
Exactly. That's what I'm planning to do.
Yeah, that's
Right. Yeah, you can use multi-layer modeling in Stella Architect now too. That's good.
what I was thinking is that you probably start just talking about doing some, breaking up and doing some of the discussions around the headed sectors.
These
So
are
that those modules give the aggregate feedback structure,
right.
which is easier to understand.
Yeah.
Right.
The Vensim sector does convey
Details. Things.
The details are underneath.
Yeah.
These are all the sectors that are in it, but they're not displayed in feedback. And there is feedback between these sectors is the critical thing. Like the more money ISIS has, the more they can do stuff. So they get access to money, they get to do more things, they get more access to money. Resistance and uprising is a limit. It's a limit to growth. That the more ISIS conquers, the more resistance and uprising they get, the less they can conquer. But it's not explicit, obviously, vividly explicit in this sort of list.
Gaming mode, you are presenting this gaming mode to people who like to use the game for training.
Yeah.
They want that detail.
Yeah.
Because in their domain there are so many options.
Right.
And they want to accommodate all those options. But in terms of creating a general theory, a generic theory, generic model which could be applied to a variety of situations, you need a more aggregate, simpler structure.
I think that's true. I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
These ones they told me to basically, here's the doctrine of options that people have. So we want to make sure that like information operations is in there because that's a doctrinal choice. But it doesn't need to be in there from any sort of theoretical standpoint. It's just there so that they can say, hey, these are one of your options, make it realistic. But I think there's a lot that could come out.
Yeah. I would think if you're talking to stakeholders that if you start out sort of what I call Forrester style and walk them through the selection of stocks and things that they consider measurable, then I think you're well down the road toward the sort of the structure of a high-level model. That's just a guess.
I'm going to look up this article, Richardson, Linus, and Navid, see what their method was for application research. I'll also look at the Forrester. I've read a lot of the Forrester stuff, obviously, but go back and review it. I want to be respectful in the time. We started late, but we're also ending a little late. So, okay. Rafat jumps in. At the bell, Rafat jumps in. I got to figure out how to find out what the chat is. There we go. Yeah. Rafat says the beauty of hierarchical models is that despite how detailed are your modules, the feedback map will still be maintained. And I think that's the key thing, because the feedback, as much as this is adjust that widget and change this parameter, this is still driven by fundamental feedback that you can't get away from. So I think that's a good point to make out. The problem is Vensim doesn't have that structure yet, and this whole thing is built in Vensim. So I think the simpler model is just being built in Stella and then have the feedback structure.
And actually now Stella has optimization and everything. I mean, they have. It's Vensim hidden under Stella.
They're actually, what they're doing with this is kind of interesting. They're taking this in a Python grab. There's a Python wraparound that takes a Vensim model and executes it in a Python environment. So your control, you'll never see Vensim. And they do it in something called Jupyter. It's a notebooks. It's an open source notebooks. But that lets them now pull data from data sets that they have somewhere else using Python code to fill in the parameters of the model for whatever it is of interest, and to take the output and put it in some additional next step down the line. So this is the middle, which is why they wanted Vensim, because the code. It's I think Stella is a lot easier to work with at this point from its ability to do templates and hierarchies and things like that. But there's apparently, and maybe there's a Python application for Stella. I don't know yet. It's an X-file, so I'd say similar should be. But,
and they're working on. I mean, they're working on that to try to extend their APIs and interface support, because they're having meetings already on that.
Who, Vensim?
No, not Vensim. Sorry, on
Stella.
The Stella folks.
They're all. It's interesting what's going on in the field in that regard for people moving direct.
He's trying to, we try to go to a new defined thing and repopulate that.
I'm going to go ahead and end the recording here, so I'm respectful of the time. I don't want to go too far over. I want to thank everyone again. No meeting next week, and the meeting after that will be Shia. Yes, we have a firm head nod. No caveats. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.